Since it's 3 o'clock, I think I'm going to go ahead and start. Let me know if you have any problems hearing me. I normally try to use a teacher voice, so hopefully I can project enough, but I can always pull the microphone up closer if I need to. So I know that there have been other sessions, especially I just came from the one couple doors down just before this, on education and the workplace as far as accommodations go. And I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about what that looks like in the classroom. I myself am a teacher and I also have narcolepsy, so I've seen both sides, both as a student with narcolepsy and as a teacher with narcolepsy. And while I can't necessarily attest to the specific legal terms, I can talk to you about what it looks like to ask for those accommodations, typical steps if it seems like the school is resistant towards providing accommodations, and then just from my experience with what kinds of accommodations tend to be addressed in the school setting. And especially for those who maybe are not interested in asking for accommodations, but just finding a way to navigate through school with narcolepsy, I would like to address that too. So this is how you can tell that I teach because everything is overly planned out. But I'll talk a little bit about what my experience looked like with narcolepsy. I was actually not diagnosed until I began teaching, but I was in school while I was having the symptoms. And then some strategies that are geared towards both students and parents of students who have narcolepsy in navigating the school system, specifically the public school system. Are there any students here that have Okay, yeah, so so I'm a high school teacher, so it's slightly geared towards that age group, but I would like to address the younger students too, as well as in the college age. So just so you know where I'm coming from as far as my background and knowledge, I may not be able to answer all of your questions, but right now I'm an English teacher at a public high school in Georgia. I teach 9th grade English, and I teach 12th grade honors English, and I also teach a remedial behavior and academic class. So I'm the RTI specialist also at that school, and that covers both students that have behavioral modifications that they're trying to make, or students who need remedial help in academics. So I've taught a wide spectrum of students and abilities as well. I did go to UNC Chapel Hill to get my undergraduate degrees, and then I stayed there to get my Master's of Arts in Teaching. College is a very difficult time for someone with narcolepsy, especially for someone who does not know they have narcolepsy. There's kind of a idea that college students are always tired in general, and this is what I thought too. So I actually did not bring up the sleepiness that I was experiencing until my first year of teaching, because I thought that it was normal for everyone to wake up and eat raw coffee beans in the morning for energy. So I was greatly kind of confused as to what normal sleepiness actually looks like. So it is possible to graduate from college with narcolepsy if you're in the middle of that and it feels like an uphill battle. It is, and I struggled through it, but part of my goal is to show people that it's possible, it's difficult, but you can still accomplish what you want to, even though it feels like maybe at times that you can't. So when I was in school, my experience is somewhat limited with narcolepsy in school because I was at the end of my senior year of high school when I started experiencing my symptoms. The way that my symptoms came on is relatively unusual. The doctors are still unsure what exactly caused the onset of my narcolepsy, but I did have a traumatic brain injury at the end of my senior year of high school, and then the symptoms started immediately after that and have been there ever since. So I don't know whether I was predisposed genetically and something happened or whether the accident caused it, but that's when my symptoms started. So my entire college experience was with the symptoms of narcolepsy, and I do have cataplexy as well. The cataplexy took precedence for me when I was trying to find out what was wrong. So you always hear that muscle weakness is something to be concerned about. You think scary things, and the internet tells you scary things about what muscle weakness can mean. So all of my testing by medical professionals was focused on the muscle weakness. And I did not ever bring up the sleepiness for about 7 years, so until well after my college experience. And from what I've heard about other people with narcolepsy at this convention, it seems like that tends to happen a lot, that the sleepiness is not brought up until it almost reaches a point that's, for me, it was dangerous for me to continue living my life the way that I was, because I just thought that it was normal to be that sleepy. So I had every test under the sun, completed, went to all different kinds of doctors, and I just kind of began to think that it was normal to feel like this, and that maybe there was something just with my muscles. So I just continued with my college experience while sometimes falling down or having buckling knees. I was misdiagnosed with things like depression or MS also. So from what I've heard of others' experiences, it seems to be similar. So my first year teaching was when I actually got diagnosed, and it was relatively recently. So this was about 2 years ago that I actually got diagnosed with narcolepsy, with cataplexy, and it's because during my commute, I was feeling sleepy, and that scared me as someone who has been in a car accident before. So I brought it up to my physician, and after finally receiving a sleep study in an MSLT, then that's when I was officially diagnosed. Medication and lifestyle changes have helped, but as I'm sure everyone knows, it's not perfect. It still feels like I'm tired than most people that are walking around every single day. And I don't think I could continue working if I didn't have a job that required me to be on my feet 24/7. So I know that it differs between people, what works for them in managing narcolepsy. For me, it's having a job that not only forces me to be accountable for others, so for my students, but also that forces me to be on my feet. It tends to help with my alertness. After work is an entire other story. So after work is normally when the crash hits. The reason that narcolepsy seems to be misunderstood in education, and I was listening to the questions from the last session as well, and it seems like a lot of students have had negative experiences in high school or in education if they have narcolepsy. And I wanted to kind of explain the reasons behind that, because I'm very interested in bettering that experience for students, even while the science may not be entirely caught up in finding a cure or finding treatments that work for everyone. So part of the problem comes from what's addressed in teacher preparation programs. Now, I received my certification in North Carolina. I teach in Georgia. There is some regional difference as far as teacher prep programs go. But in general, the way that narcolepsy or sleep disorders is addressed for teachers when they're learning how to teach tends to be very general, and narcolepsy is rarely, if ever, addressed by name. So we do learn about various conditions that might inhibit learning for students, but a lot of the focus is on the symptoms rather than actually implementing interventions and assistance in the classroom. And from talking to various 504 chairs and IEP chairs and other teachers who have gone through preparation programs, this seems to be pretty consistent. The kinds of conditions that are addressed in teacher prep programs are the more widely known ones, like ADHD or dyslexia, or even behavioral disorders, but not necessarily sleep disorders, and especially not narcolepsy. So most teachers actually are unaware of narcolepsy, and I've had teachers think that it was epilepsy. It was just another name for epilepsy. So that's the level of kind of a lack of education that's out there. So although it should never be on the student to have to educate others, especially those providing them services about their own condition, I tend to tell students to come into an education setting with the knowledge that you are probably the expert on your condition, and to have resources on hand that let them help you. So because of the lack of awareness, coming to the table with resources that help educate the school psychologists, the teachers, the administrators, has been what seems to be helpful in most cases that I've witnessed, although it cannot always be the case. Everyone's experiences are different. So special education teachers do receive more preparation for the types of conditions that might cause difficulties in a school environment. But even then, if narcolepsy is addressed, it tends to be as a secondary symptom. So narcolepsy often is mentioned in special education programs, but almost as a symptom of a traumatic brain injury, which if you have seen the list of the disabilities that are covered under IDEA, traumatic brain injury is one of those. Narcolepsy should be eligible under other health impairments if you are seeking accommodations, but the way that it's addressed in teacher prep programs tends to be with the assumption that it is somehow related to a traumatic brain injury. And that's one of the kind of areas of misconception that a lot of people have regarding narcolepsy is what even the condition is. And it's not a temporary symptom that arises as a result of an injury. It's an actual condition that would normally fall under the other category. So my point is just to show you where some of the miscommunication comes when it comes to understanding narcolepsy in an educational setting on the side of the teacher. And this is obviously a problem because by limiting the types of conditions that teachers are aware of, it keeps them from having a mindset that benefits students with exceptionalities that they might not be familiar with. So we'll get into some common scenarios in a little bit, but I've heard a lot of students say things like the teacher will slap their desk with a ruler if they fall asleep in class or something, or make it into like a public kind of joke that they haven't gotten enough sleep. And that becomes very problematic when you consider students with narcolepsy who this is the reality that they're living with every day. It's not a joke to them. And there's this kind of misconception that they're just too tired. So part of that comes from this limited awareness of the types of sleep disorders. So I did interview my 504 chair, and we'll talk about the difference between a 504 plan and an IEP and what this looks like. And I was asking her what some of the common issues seem to be, according to her experience, on the level of rare health disorders in students or lesser known health conditions. And she says, and I agree with this from what I've seen in the classroom, that teachers might be familiar with the terminology of various health conditions, but they're ill-equipped at times to actually implement strategies that help the students succeed in the classroom. So maybe they can give you the symptoms of various conditions or even the acts under which certain disabilities are covered legally, but when it comes to actually experience in the classroom, this is where sometimes there's a gap, and that they seem to maybe lack the resources or training necessary to help one-on-one a student who has narcolepsy and who's struggling in school. There is a large population of teachers, administrators, who are possibly under the impression that certain health conditions don't exist. So that narcolepsy is just simply being tired a lot. And it's discouraging to hear this. I can't pretend like this does not happen. I'm fortunate to teach at a school that does not have teachers or administrators like this, but I know that they are out there, and I know that it has really hindered people's experiences in high school and education. There also, if you are a student, maybe this is familiar to you, but there also are practices that are referred to as behavior-based grading, which are technically illegal. So teachers should not be doing this. But things such as deducting excessive late points for assignments, such as 10 points per day late, but kind of indefinitely until the point where an essay, for example, that would normally be a 90 would be a 20% because it was turned in so late. You can see where this would disproportionately affect students who have something like narcolepsy, who have executive functioning skills that they need to develop. Timeliness is not a standard under Common Core standards, but there is this kind of persistent behavior-based grading that happens in schools. I've heard of teachers who have limited bathroom passes per semester, which is appalling to me, because this is one of those examples of behaviors being emphasized in a classroom that is meant to grade standards. There is a shift towards what's called standards-based grading, though, happening right now in education, and that is starting to address some of these things, but the reality is there are still a lot of teachers who maybe don't realize that these grading practices are harmful and even discourage students from even wanting to turn in the assignment in the first place. So common scenarios that either I have been a part of myself as a student with narcolepsy, or that I've witnessed from speaking to other students is, for example, a student falls asleep in class and is reprimanded by the teacher, sometimes even publicly or as a joke, for going to bed too late at night. If they miss an assignment during the class, it might be incomplete. They were maybe unable to finish it. Perhaps that they're unable to turn it in late, or they have to simply turn in what they have, and this in turn affects their grade in the class. And this is not exclusive to narcolepsy either. There are many health conditions that actually could be adversely affected from something like this. A student could have a cataplexy attack in school, and then the school nurse or the school guidance counselors might assume that the student is unconscious, call an ambulance. This has happened before because there's just a lack of education surrounding what cataplexy looks like and what it means. The general consensus tends to be that it's almost like a seizure, and so it's treated as such. So these are just examples of how a lack of awareness about narcolepsy could impact a student in an educational setting. Similarly, I've seen younger students with their parents have talked to me about their handwriting being adversely affected from some kind of condition, narcolepsy included, and if the teacher takes off points for messiness or something like that, that is an example of behavior-based grading. Should not be the case, yet it's still happening. So part of my goal is to talk about how to address things like this and prevent them from happening before you even come into the classroom. What I talk about has been successful for the students that I've talked to, but it in no way encompasses the diverse experiences of people with narcolepsy or the diverse experiences in schools. So I can't guarantee that that all of these will work for everyone, but I just wanted to share some helpful strategies that I've noticed as far as making sure that students receive what they need to get the best education that they can. So for parents with children who have narcolepsy in like an elementary school setting, establishing early communication about the nature of the child's narcolepsy has shown to be, from the parents that I've talked to, has shown to be helpful. So coming to the table with resources that say what narcolepsy looks like in their child, what tends to help them as a parent, you know best, what tends to help improve their focus, what tends to bring on a cataplexy attack. So coming to the school with resources beforehand to show them this is what it looks like and this is what tends to benefit them. Often parents will request a meeting with the teachers before the child even enters a grade level or even enters a school, and have everyone at the table who will come into contact with the child and explain to them, this is the condition, these are the accommodations if they have a 504 IEP in place, to make sure that there's no misunderstanding among teachers about how to follow the accommodations, because they are legally required to follow them. So making sure that there's no kind of lapses in understanding early tends to make sure that the relationship is a positive one rather than an adversarial one earlier on in the school process. And then if there's particular protocol, especially for young children, that you would prefer if, for example, they happen to fall asleep at an inopportune time or have a cataplexy attack, making that clear from the beginning as the parent what you would like to happen if that happens in the classroom, establishing that protocol right away so that the teacher or whoever's in the classroom does not feel unsure about how to proceed, because cataplexy is not widely known about. And so if you explain to them in advance what it might look like. In high school, I have been a part of a lot of transition meetings from middle school into high school, in which the parents, and this has been very helpful for the students, the parents and the student will have a meeting before the year begins and explain anything that they would like the teachers to know prior to the first day in class. So this can concern health conditions, it can concern outside information, exceptions, or things that they've been going through at the time. It's not always necessary, but if there is something that might impact their educational experience, this is one of the ways to make sure that everyone understands from an early point in the school career. I've had parents, not necessarily about narcolepsy, but bring fact sheets about, for example, autism spectrum disorders. At the beginning of 9th grade, bring a fact sheet, bring resources for the teachers to have in their classrooms. It is not on you to do this. So for parents, there are resources out there to pull from, and especially Narcolepsy Network has some existing resource guides that are very helpful to print out and keep in. I've printed out one, for example, and kept it in our school nurse's office for quick reference. So it's not that you have to go and do all this extra work to hand to the teachers or the nurses. There are quick references, and I'll explain to you later some of the websites. I think I have a slide about them that have these already made, and it's as simple as printing them out so that they at least have a quick reference if they forget, for example, what cataplexy is or what narcolepsy is. I do suggest that as students move through to the end of high school, that communication with teachers kind of becomes on the student's responsibility, because you do have to reapply. If you receive services in high school, you do have to reapply with the Office of Disability Services in a college for accommodations again. The 504 plan or the IEP does not necessarily then transfer on into college. So developing these strategies early for high school students to be able to self-advocate and to tell teachers, even to introduce themselves at the beginning of a school year and say, I just wanted to reach out and introduce myself. This is my name. These are the quick accommodations on my sheet. If you have any questions about narcolepsy, feel free to ask. This is one of the quick ways to kind of establish a positive relationship early on, to make sure that you feel comfortable communicating with your teachers, but also to kind of assist in the transition to college, in which sometimes parents will not be, I've seen quite a few instances where they will say they need to speak to the student directly because of confidentiality laws once a student is over 18. So this is a skill to kind of develop early to make sure that all of a sudden once they graduate high school, that it's entirely new territory for them, having to talk to only by themselves to the Office of Disability Services. That is what happened with me. So at the time, I did not know that it was narcolepsy. I thought it was a physical disability from the cataplexy, and I had to register with the Office of Disability Services because I was having a hard time walking from my dorm to my classes. It was about a mile. I was having a lot of cataplexy attacks, and at the time I assumed that it was something to do with my muscles. But I had never had the experience of communicating or advocating on behalf of myself with the college, and whenever my parents would call, they would say we need to speak with the student directly because of confidentiality laws. So it was a very steep learning curve. So it's something that is helpful to start in high school. And then in college also, there often tends to be some degree of flexibility in scheduling your classes. So to the best of your ability, I would try to determine what times of day you are most productive and try to consistently schedule your classes for those times of day. There are times when it will be unavoidable that you will have to take a class at a certain time, and that's always very difficult. But if you try to schedule the bulk of your classes during the time of day that you are most productive, for me it has been helpful, at least with those classes. There is the option of introducing yourself to professors ahead of time and explaining the situation so that, for example, you don't have that kind of situation with falling asleep in class and maybe a professor calls you out on it in a kind of embarrassing way. So letting them know in advance, this is what happens. You don't need to say anything about it. I normally will come to, and these are the strategies I've developed to compensate for that, such as the smart pen, which I know that a lot of people, not smart pen, does anyone know what that, the pen? The live scribe? Yeah, live scribe, is that what it's called? This has been, yeah, a lot of universities will offer those as accommodations, not only for narcolepsy, but for ADHD or other attention disorders. And this has been, it has worked wonders for students who maybe will fall asleep, because I'll show you an example of what happens when you fall asleep while taking notes. And if you look back at my college notes, there are pages where they just kind of scroll off the page because I fell asleep while taking notes and I just kept writing nonsense. So if I would have had that kind of pen in college, all I would have had to do is touch the page where my writing starts to slant off the page, and it would play out where the teacher was in the lecture and actually play the lecture out for me to hear. So it's amazing technology. It's available for many other students besides those with narcolepsy, but asking whether the university offers those is beneficial. And a lot of them, more and more universities are offering these, I've found. Yes, I think it's Live, is it L-I-V-E? Live Scribe, S-C-R-I-B-E. Yes.
And just another thing, I'm a college freshman,
Mm-hmm.
and I know my school does it, and I know a few others. They have programs in place where other students take notes for you.
Yes.
So like I don't know if they double their notes or however it works, but like if I'm falling asleep in class and I don't know what my notes say, if there's someone else I can go to and get a copy of theirs, or if they just write them generally and somehow distribute them. I don't know how it works, but they also have those.
Yes, and so this also happens in high school. In colleges, at least at my college, there were students who volunteered to be scribes in classes. So they would offer to take notes. They were students who were good at taking notes, who offered their services for students who might need copies of notes. I also know that sometimes some programs will do that as some kind of experience-based learning, or there are jobs that allow them to do this. But there are many different avenues where the student will provide quality notes to someone in the class who is eligible to receive note-taking assistance. In high school, the way that it normally works is either a student, such as a friend, will volunteer to do it if they've grown up with that student, but in most cases, it's a teacher's copies of notes. So for my students who have 504 plans or IEPs that allow them to receive note-taking assistance, if I'm ever doing a presentation, I'll have a copy of the notes with me for any student who then is eligible. I normally make them at least attempt to take notes first on their own, and then at the end, did I say phone? On their own? And then they do ask to take notes on their phone. But at the end of class, then I'll provide them a teacher's copy always, just so that they can make sure there's no discrepancies in the writing. And if you are in the process of getting 504 accommodations or IEPs, that is something that you can request of the team that's evaluating the student, is note-taking assistance if you know that that's something that they struggle with. And I would always recommend asking for a teacher's copy of the notes, because students aren't always the best note takers, but if the teacher's the one making the presentation, then the teacher can easily print out a copy, fill in the blanks, to then see if there's any discrepancies with the student's notes. Let me see, let me move ahead a little bit. One thing aside from accommodations, which I'll get to in just a minute, that can be helpful for students with narcolepsy, and that was helpful for me because I didn't know that there were accommodations available for me. I struggled throughout college, and a lot of accommodations that are in place today would have been very helpful for me at the time, is to maintain an organized agenda. For me, it's color coding, but something that forces you to record the information in maybe different areas. So for example, I've had students who have an agenda in class that they will write down important reminders, important due dates, but then they have a calendar at home in their room that they, at the end of each day, transfer the important reminders onto the calendar, so that they're given the information in multiple different ways. You can also ask teachers, if it's not being done already, to display important reminders in various locations, so to not only tell them instructions, but to give a copy of handouts of instructions and to post them on their teacher website, for example. I've seen cases where the teacher will say, well, I gave this student the verbal instructions in class that this assignment was due tomorrow, but for many people with narcolepsy, and I know for me, that is not enough for me to know that the assignment is due. I would immediately forget after an hour. So to have also a paper copy of instructions and an online source to go to if the paper copy happens to be misplaced along the way. That is an easy way to make sure that the teacher then has all of the information displayed for the students. Reading in particular, especially reading long passages, was my biggest issue because I would fall asleep within a couple of pages. And as an English teacher, I have a lot of students who I can tell have the same experience as I did. So I know that people have various ways of coping with this, and if any current student has strategies that work for them that I don't cover, please share so that other people can benefit from them. But for me, setting a time limit at 10 minutes was about as much as I could handle for reading a lengthy passage and then taking a break to either walk around, to do jumping jacks, to listen to music, to watch something on TV, some kind of just sensory break so that I wasn't sitting and reading for long periods of time. If there's anyone who has strategies that have worked for them, is there anyone that has others to add as far as reading passages, long passages go? I don't know if it, yeah.
It's not necessarily a strategy, but maybe just something helpful to keep you responsible. Before I got diagnosed and knew what was going on, I had a book that I just could not get through for my class, and I went up to my teacher and I told her, and I was crying.
Mm-hmm.
But I told her, and she was okay with me sitting in the classroom and reading the book while she was there. So I knew that there was someone there keeping me responsible, and she would help me keep away to make sure I was on task. So not necessarily your teacher, but just having a study buddy, whether it be a partner, parent, partner, friend, maybe an awesome teacher to help keep you awake, to help keep you on task or engaged. If you need to talk to someone about what you read to make sure you actually absorb the information.
Yeah, no, that sounds really helpful. Yeah.
I asked my daughter in high school, so I've asked the teacher if the book comes in Audible.
Yes, yes.
And if it doesn't, I ask, is there something equivalent that she could read that maybe is not with what the rest of the class is doing?
Yes.
But something that's equivalent to where she can play it, because that I know is
It works wonders for
Yeah.
students, yeah. And a lot of teachers also, I know that I've been trying to build my library of audio versions of books as well, because I teach a lot of students who sitting and reading, especially in silence, is difficult for them. So there might also, even if your teacher doesn't have a copy, odds are that there might be another teacher at the school who has those kinds of resources available. And so just asking either the head of the department, that makes a huge difference, I found, for students.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But I'm a teacher also, and I have used audiobooks for students before with narcolepsy, because I've had students who literally have had to get like on a treadmill.
Right.
Or something like that as they're listening to the book.
Right, right. I used to sit on a stationary bike to read my longer passages in college because it made me move. And if you have a teacher that maybe doesn't quite understand the toll that something like sitting for an entire class period and reading a book will take on a student with narcolepsy, one of the other accommodations too, and even outside of the 504 and IEP situations, you can also ask that whenever a novel is being assigned, especially for maybe younger high school students, middle school students, elementary school, that the teacher maybe breaks down the book into chunks so that they have almost little checkpoints to reach so that they can finish the book on time. So that's actually one of the official accommodations on 504 plans and IEPs. It's called chunking. I see it all the time, but it means breaking down either a longer assignment or a longer reading passage into smaller, more digestible bits so that it's not so overwhelming. For students with anxiety too, that makes a big difference because often receiving that first large project explanation is so overwhelming that it almost paralyzes them with moving forward. So to break it down in small bits so that they can literally check off each step tends to at least make it a little bit more attainable for them, especially for long-term assignments. If the strategies outside of the 504 and the IEP plans are not effective, and you are seeking accommodations through either Section 504 or IDEA, there's a process to go through to request either. And I know that the last session was explaining the difference between an IEP and a 504 plan, which I'll talk a little bit about too. I would suggest that the moment that you decide that a 504 plan or an IEP is something that you'd like to pursue, to send that initial request in writing so that you have documentation. There are laws regarding how soon after that initial email goes out that the teachers then have the official eligibility meeting and take the required assessments to see if the student is eligible. So as long as you have that paper trail that you requested this on this date, they are then held accountable. I don't know the exact date. I hesitate to say because I'm mainly familiar with Georgia laws, but they have a limited window of time in which that assessment must occur. So they have to see whether the student is eligible either under a 504 plan or an IEP. In most cases, the 504 eligibility is done outside of the school. So for example, the doctor or whoever is giving the diagnosis will suggest that academic supports are needed in place. That's why, and I agree that the legal advocate that was in the other session mentioned if your student is eligible under IDEA for an IEP, that has more protections in place, and to seek eligibility through that way first, because the school has to perform the free assessment through a variety of different services, psychological, speech therapy, depending on the condition. And it's a little bit more regulated. So seeing if you're eligible that way first and then pursuing a 504 tends to be the recommendation, but it's a case-by-case basis, and some students don't need the accommodations that are offered through an IEP, only the environmental accommodations that something like a 504 plan would address. So narcolepsy, even though it's not mentioned by name in teacher prep programs when we talk about these laws, would fall under the other health impairments category for both 504 plans and for IEPs. And the way that the law defines an individual with a disability for these services is an individual with a disability means any person who has a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity, has a record of such impairment, or is regarded as having such an impairment. And the key here is substantially limiting one or more major life activities. So for an IEP, if your narcolepsy is hindering your performance in the classroom, that would be substantially limiting a life activity. So then if narcolepsy was affecting you to that point, then you can be eligible for accommodations under the federal law to ensure that you receive the same potential for success as everyone else in the classroom and are not limited by your condition. So the differences between an IEP and 504 plans, there's a website called understood.org that has a really great chart that explains in detail different domains and how an IEP differs from a 504 plan in each of those domains. So for example, how you request eligibility, what it covers, what to do if you want an amendment, it differs between each plan. So I recommend going to the website, but in short, some of the differences are that an IEP often concerns changes in the curriculum. So it means modifications in a general education classroom or in a small group classroom to ensure that the student is receiving a quality education, because just simply receiving the same form of instruction that everyone else is receiving is not enough. So in some way their condition is impacting the way that they receive that instruction. And so then they receive supplemental instructional materials to help solidify whatever was given in class. As it was mentioned in the last session, being considered eligible for an IEP is somewhat sticky, and there's been a lot of parents who have had situations where a child's academic performance is impacted by the condition, but they are found not eligible. And there are steps to go through in case this happens. So you are actually entitled to a second evaluation that is then given, again, free of charge by an outside service. So what I would recommend, if you ever encounter issues with maybe non-compliance or non-eligibility, and you feel like your student is not receiving the kind of education that you would like for them to receive, or is somehow being discriminated against, going up the chain of command first rather than jumping directly to an advocate tends to show the most success. So for example, if it's in one particular class, contacting the administrator of the school or the special education chair or the 504 chair with your concerns. And if the administration is resistant, going up and contacting the principal and requesting a meeting. So in working your way up, and most districts too have a exceptional student services department that you can contact with any problems at any of the area of schools with following 504 IEPs. So if for some reason, not only the teacher, but the administrator and the principal seems to be resistant in granting that eligibility or following that 504 plan, there are departments in the county that deal with those kinds of issues. So, you know, I'll post my email again at the end of this presentation, but if you ever have questions about how to proceed, I mean, I can't offer legal advice, I'm not a lawyer or anything like that, but I can suggest maybe who to contact for educational purposes that would get you a quick response and that would be the right department for solving those kinds of issues. It happens often, I'm sad to say, is that non-compliance with 504 plans and IEPs, why, I don't know. I'm sure it has something to do with the kind of lack of awareness in the prep programs. But knowing this and knowing maybe how to proceed with contacting the correct person up the chain of command can allow the student to be impacted the least by issues of non-compliance. 504 plans tend to concern changes to the learning environment a lot. So for example, frequent breaks, that's not changing the instructional method for the student, but it is allowing them some kind of behavioral modification or some kind of environment modification that then makes the learning easier for them based on their condition. To request accommodations, your school might have a 504 chair or a department head of the special education program that you can reach out to. I would keep records of academic struggles, so any emails that you've sent teachers, any records of failing grades or assignments that have been impacted, all of this tends to make this process easier for you as the parent. If you have some examples of how the student has been impacted by narcolepsy specifically when you go to the eligibility meeting. So being able to point to certain classes, certain skills, certain tasks that they struggle with will make determining those accommodations easier for all of the people involved at the meeting. Often you will also need not official medical records, so not extensive medical records that have nothing to do with the condition at hand, but some kind of proof of diagnosis in a doctor's note that explains maybe how the condition impacts the educational situation, because to be considered eligible, it has to impact their learning experience. So if a school ever requests entire medical records, they do not need to do that. They should not be asking for that. It should be solely regarding the condition at hand that's impacting their experience in school. And so the way that I normally see parents do this is through just a letter, a formal letter from the physician, faxed to the school saying, yes, this student does have this condition. It is severe enough to impact education. Here are some recommended accommodations, and even if the doctor doesn't put those, the school then can help work with the parents and decide those accommodations. But I've seen doctors also suggest them before. And then the school professionals will then guide you through the process of determining the accommodations for your student based on what particular skills they struggle with. I know we just have about 5 minutes left, but Julie, who's also known for her memoir that she published about her experiences with narcolepsy, has actually a comprehensive list that she's compiled from various parents and students who have these accommodations. And on her website, there is a section called School Accommodations that you can go to, and these are individuals providing their experiences, such as leniences on tardies or absences that maybe would impact disciplinary records or something like that at a school normally, allowing snacks during class so that they can keep busy, keeping a designated area for scheduled naps, the teacher copy of notes that was mentioned, extended time on homework assignments in case of sleep attacks. This is just a short list of some of the ones that people have mentioned, but as we have heard in the last session, or as I've heard, the 504 plans are really on an individual basis, just like with IDEA. So it's not like one condition has a list of prescribed accommodations with it. It's based on the individual student's needs. And then also, don't hesitate to speak up if you feel like you are not experiencing the educational accommodations that you're entitled to through an IEP or a 504 plan. If you suspect something like noncompliance, speaking up about it and first addressing it with the instructor of the class at hand, but also not hesitating to contact school authorities about these issues. It does happen, and if early positive communication is established in the process, it tends to prevent most of these issues. In most cases, it tends to be miscommunication on the teacher's part or on the doctor's part, where there's a misunderstanding of the nature of the condition. So although this happens often, it doesn't always have to be such an adversarial experience if early communication is established. And if you still encounter resistance, there are legal advocates that deal directly with 504 plans and IEPs. I've had many meetings where at a 504 meeting to see how the student is progressing, the family has asked, for example, the head of the special education department for the county to be present, just to make sure, to hear from each teacher, to make sure that the accommodations are being followed. So that is something that you can ask for. I know that every state is different, every school is different, but there are people who care very much about this issue, myself included, and are advocates to make sure that those plans are being followed. So the bottom line that I just wanted to get across is that because the nature of narcolepsy is so misunderstood among the general public, that unfortunately also permeates the educational environment. And until the science catches up and until awareness is spread, self-advocating for your own needs in education can help with spreading that awareness. So although there will still be people who assume that you're just too sleepy or too quote-unquote lazy or unmotivated, explaining the nature of what narcolepsy looks like for you and what you need can allow you to have a lot of success in the educational environment. So we might still have a long way to go, but there are organizations in place, there are online resources that are in place. There are also programs. Wake Up Narcolepsy, for example, has a program called Narcolepsy Goes to School that is a series of workshops and educational materials aimed at schools and school nurses and school psychologists to increase awareness. So going to that website too and taking a look at it, you can request that materials be sent to you or to your school if you know that you want your school to have more of an understanding of your condition. But like I said, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My email address is skagsj@fultonschools.org. In addition to the students at my school, I also remain in contact with students at different schools who have narcolepsy. It's hard to find other teachers and students with narcolepsy, so you're always welcome to reach out to me with questions about education or living with narcolepsy. And I know that people at the school will are there in place too, yes.
Where did you get your bracelet made? Because
Oh.
I've looked for like something that I would like to wear every day, or
Yeah.
especially for just cataplexy.
Yeah.
And I haven't found one, so I like
So
yours.
I'm not sure, but I think I actually got this as a gift
Okay.
because I had the same experience. And I do have a medical card in my wallet with my medications, and this is linked to that. But I know that there's a website online that's dedicated to making like pretty jewelry-like, but also very clear medical alert bracelets. I wish I knew the name of it. Yes, Laura's Hope. Is that what it is? Laura's Hope? Yeah. Yes, Laura's Hope. They have really nice looking medical alert bracelets. So that's where I got it from. I know it's right at time.
Back up to the last read.
Sure. Yeah, sorry. I I know I went quickly at the end. And that's all I have. So you're welcome to stay and ask questions if you have questions. But thank you for for attending.